You're most welcome to the first edition of our webinar series for the year 2021. And let me take this opportunity to extend our best wishes to all of you for this year. This actually tends to be the 5th edition since we started the webinar series in 2020. That was just last year. And I'm so grateful to have you here join us for this afternoon's session. My name is Akosia Achiabiasaki. I am your moderator. Without wasting much time, I'll quickly get to the director for the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy and Documentation, CEGRAD. It is CEGRAD that is actually organizing this webinar that we're having this afternoon. So I'll get to Dr. Georgina Yao-Odro, and she'll give us her welcome messages.
Thank you very much, Akosia, and good afternoon to us all, depending on which part of the continent you find yourself. We are really happy to have you back to our webinar series for 2021. This is the first for the year, and this is being organized by the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy and Documentation of the University of Cape Coast, as our moderator said. You're welcome to the new year because it's the first edition for the new year. And in Ghana, we'll say Afishiapa, which is the local expression of welcome to you all. So applause and then divine Afishiapa to you all. We are happy to have you around, as well as Teresa. You are one of us already. So how did this whole webinar series come about? It was born out of the COVID epidemic. COVID has been a real disaster, but out of it have been opportunities as well. Ours is a very small center, opened in 2013, so it's comparatively young. And we were having a seminar series once a week. Then all of a sudden, COVID emerged. So it became difficult for us to congregate and then share our knowledge in the area of gender, since gender is cross-cutting and it's not situated in a particular faculty. So it was for all staff and graduate students of the university, irrespective of the discipline you find yourself in. So now we have to move. And then luckily, it's giving birth to partnership and internationalization, for which reason we're having Lindsay and then Divine join us, as well as other students from around the globe for our series. Yes, so why this topic on masculinities? In the field of gender studies, we do know that femininities or women's studies and sexuality studies have really dominated, but not much is known about masculinities, and people are always shouting, you're always promoting women, women, women issues. What about the men? So we decided to explore the subject matter of masculinity today. So in this discussion, we're going to look at what exactly is masculinities. What are the constructions? How different are masculine constructions within different cultures? For example, in the Ghanaian sociocultural context, as against the South African and then the Western context, what are some of the things we look at? We are also happy to learn about some of the theories that are often used in masculinity research projects. People have asked, is it all about feminism? Outside feminism, which other theories are relevant in the field of masculinity studies? And to help us explore these, we're going to have 3 great speakers. We are first happy to have Dr. Teresa Adda-mununkum, who is an expert in English and then masculinity, especially in the area of literature. And she'll be taking us through discourses and constructions of masculinities in terms of the origins and trends. We'll have Dr. Divine, who of the African Humanities Center, take us through constructions of masculinities in popular culture with a focus on young people, their aspiration, their agency, and pathways of becoming. Then we're going to have Professor Lindsay Claus also take us through masculinity in the scholarship of gender studies. And why is it that women tend to dominate this field? Just when we floated our poster, someone sent a message to us. Why do we have 2 women speaking on masculinities and not 3 men speaking on the subject matter? Unfortunately, that was a comment we just had today. So we are happy to learn from Professor Lindsay Claus why women dominate in this field. Why are they absent? What exactly is pushing them out? And is there any way we are going to help bring them on board? These are some of the things we want to explore. So this afternoon, we are happy to have you all. We also want to send our very special thanks and gratitude to our audience. Without them, we can't have this seminar series. We've had some people who have been very, very faithful from the very first one in September till this 5th edition. They've always been with us. We appreciate you all. Let us learn, share experiences, and then ask questions, brainstorm. It's a relaxed space to explore and learn from each other. So on this note, we welcome all of you, our speakers and our audience, and we thank our moderator for consistently being there for us, and then the staff of the center, the university at large, and all and sundry. Welcome to this afternoon's edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Udro. We're grateful for your words this afternoon. Let me just move on and introduce our panelists for today. My director has already mentioned who they are, but then I will be telling you a bit more about them, and then we'll be delving into our subject for today, and that is masculinities, anxieties, and acceptances. So I'll start with Dr. Theresa Adda-mununkum. Now, she's a senior lecturer at the Department of English, College of Humanities and Legal Studies here at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Her teaching and research areas are African literature, literary theory, masculinities, gender and writing, queer theory, gender identity, and sexuality studies, and literary and artistic constructions of gender and sex. She also is the current coordinator for advocacy and outreach at the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy and Documentation, CEGRAD, here at UCC. Dr. Adda-mununkum was also a student lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2013, and also as the language coordinator and administrator for the Ghana Cape Coast site for the School for International Training, Vermont, in 2003 to 2007. She obtained her PhD in African languages and literature from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2013 in the USA, where she was a Fulbright scholar. She's a member of the African Literature Association and the African Studies Association. She has won a number of academic awards locally and internationally, including the 2018 ASA Presidential Fellows Award and a 2014 ACLS African Humanities. Dr. Theresa Adda-mununkum, just give us a wave and say hello to us, and then we'll acknowledge you here.
Hello.
Right, sure. You're most welcome. So, Dr. Divine Fu, you're next. Now, he's a graduate of the Swiss postgraduate program in ethnology anthropology. He holds a BSc in journalism and mass communication and political science from the University of Boa in Cameroon, MA in development studies from the University of Botswana, and a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Basel in Switzerland. He has taught at the Universities of Basel in Switzerland, Western Cape, and Stellenbosch in South Africa, Brasilia in Brazil, and the University of Tokyo in Japan. He has been a visiting fellow at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, Germany, and the African Studies Center in Leiden, the Netherlands. Dr. Fu joined the University of Cape Town in 2012 and has since worked there. He currently coordinates the research group Fixing the City, with research interest in youth, masculinities, aspirations, precarity, agency, entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, popular culture, and sustainability. Dr. Fu is the current director of the Institute for Humanities in Africa in Cape Town, South Africa. Doc, you're most welcome. You can just say hello and we would acknowledge you here.
Hello.
Sure. Thank you very much. So last but no way the least, I have Professor Lindsay Close. Professor Lindsay Close is a feminist historian in women and gender studies and former deputy dean in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Western Cape, Cape Town, South Africa. Some of her recent works reflect gender and masculinities in teaching for social justice in socially just ways in the South African context. She's interested in the limitations and possibilities of and for feminist, decolonial, and transformatory pedagogies. Professor Close, you're warmly welcome.
Thank you.
Sure. So thank you to our panelists. Very soon we'll be digging in, but I see Professor Mukwando online. We have our provost online now, and he would quickly share a few words, and then our discussion will start. Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity. And it is nice that we have resumed academic work and we are having our first webinar. And I hope that we are going to deliberate on an important topic, and at the end, we are all going to be refreshed. So I count myself lucky to be part of this session, and I welcome everybody. And I hope that we are going to be active participants in this important webinar series. Thank you for the opportunity.
Right, thank you very much. We had Professor Mukwando. He is the provost for the College of Humanities and Legal Studies here at the University of Cape Coast. Thank you so much for joining us. So as Dr. Drew earlier on indicated, a lot of people think that immediately you talk of gender, it is more women-centered. And for today, we're looking at something a bit different. We're looking at masculinities, anxieties, and acceptances. Our panel is will start with their presentation. Each individual will have between 10 to 15 minutes to make the presentation he or she has. And so I'm starting with Dr. Theresa Adda-mununkum, and she'll be looking at discourses and constructions of masculinities, origins, and trends. Dr. Adda-mununkum, please go on.
Thank you very much, Akosia, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to come and listen to us so that we all share ideas and learn things. I'd like to begin with a historical overview of masculinity or masculinities. So a little over 2 decades ago, masculinity studies or men's studies, or if I should say a little over 3 decades ago, was born as a response to the growing undercurrent of discontent with the establishment of feminist gender critique as a force for social change in the 1960s and 70s. Coming of age in the 1980s, under a shadow of a decidedly female-driven sexual politics, the study of men and masculinity faced a crisis of confidence in its ability to engage a theoretical framework for challenging the intellectual arguments against male power and dominance in the social system. Consequently, the first 2 works to be published from this discourse betrayed the influence that feminist criticism had had on it. 2 of these, both published in 1987, are The Making of Masculinities, The New Men's Studies, and Changing Men, New Directions in Research on Men and Masculinities. Scholars in men's studies concede that masculinity, like femininity, is socially constructed, and masculine identities coming out of their environment are liable to change. Like women's studies, men's studies approach a wide array of subjects such as anthropology, history, literature, and cultural studies, among others. This interdisciplinary nature affords it the opportunity to unearth the underlying factors of race, sexuality, and ethnicity that go into the making of masculinity. Apart from the need to mark masculinity and take it as an explicit object of analysis so as to better understand what it is and how it functions, many critics believe that there is the need to focus attention on the study of men as gendered beings in order to reflect and re-examine traditional concepts of masculinity and manhood. When masculinity is understood as a gendered ideology, just like femininity, the potential to envisage a common agenda between the two becomes clearer. Masculinity is variously inflected and defined. Generally, scholars agree that it is an identity marker that is constructed by historical circumstances and social discourses, and not primarily by biology. This indicates an important characteristic of masculinity as constructed and not inherently innate. McLaury, 1992, describes masculinity as being about the values, expectations, and interpretations which men have attached to the idea of being a man. Therefore, he argues that it is possible for men to behave differently if they understand that these ideas can be challenged and changed. Todorisa, 2010, also argues that a person's conception and understanding of masculinity is bound to change when he moves from one place to another. This is because the values and interpretations of masculinity are not universal. Each culture has its own definitions and expectations of masculinity, which may sometimes be the exact opposite of some other culture. For example, while men in India can walk arm in arm together, it might not be the standard masculine behavior in some modern American cultures. Apart from being culturally specific, masculinity is also historically specific. In the same culture, behavior that was seen as masculine in the 19th century may not be seen as such in the 21st century. As a result of these differences in time and space, masculinity is studied not as a single definition, but as variable and complex, giving rise to the more current expression, masculinities. Critics then argue that because masculinity is a culturally specific and socially functional gender identity, we should be cognizant of its peculiar and often negative consequences on men. We should be cognizant that the performance of masculinity has effects on its performance. Todorisa makes this claim in the light of the fact that gender identities, as presently defined, obscure social possibilities for men themselves. Mugambi and Allen, 2010, in the Introduction to Masculinities in African Literary and Cultural Texts, assert that practitioners of the field of men's studies have acknowledged from the very beginning that masculinity, like femininity, is socially constructed and, like their environment, liable to change. So this has called for a sustained focus on the fluid, unstable, and contradictory nature of masculinity, in stark contrast to the hegemonic view of an unchangeable and undifferentiated maleness. And when we look at the Ghanaian situation, research on masculinity in Ghana is a growing field, actually. Of much importance is Stephen F. Marshall's work, Making Men in Ghana, 2005, which explores the changing meaning of being a man in Ghana through the life histories of 8 senior men from Kou in the eastern region of the country. Other research have taken place on masculinity in Ghana, although most tend to be from the social sciences. We can talk of Obing 2003, Edinkra 2012, Amwako Hene 2004, Tichi Enman 2006, Adumakwan Pofo and Boateng 2007, and Sapo 1991. They all affirm the multiplicity and dynamism of masculinity in Ghana. In his work, Obing examines pre-colonial Asante and concludes that pre-colonial Asante's notions of masculinity revolved around men's capacity to exercise authority over women and junior men, accumulate wealth, and exhibit courage and bravery in the face of the adversity of war. According to Edinkra, cultural constructions of masculinity and femininity in contemporary Ghanaian society include a belief in the fundamental biological distinctions between male and female human nature, as well as corresponding behavioral prescriptions. Therefore, men are expected, for instance, to be hardworking and women to be nurturing. It is frowned upon when a man exhibits behavioral traits generally associated with being a woman. Adumako Ampofo and Boateng indicates that the stratification of gender roles is often reinforced by traditions that are passed down from one generation to the next. For example, before the advent of formal education in Ghana, the Akan would send their sons as apprentices to a master craftsman, an orator, or a statesman to learn a vocation for life. During this apprenticeship process, definitions of appropriate masculinity were transmitted. Male characteristics that were approved or encouraged included virility, strength, authority, power and leadership qualities, the ability to offer protection and sustenance in the form of intelligence and wisdom, and the ability to bear emotional and physical pain. Oral literature in the form of stories, songs, and proverbs is another avenue whereby gender stratification is reinforced. Several proverbs in Akan culture portray men as brave and capable in handling difficult situations. Examples of such proverbs are, when a gun is fired, the man who receives the bullet on his chest. Even if a woman buys a drum, it is kept in a man's heart. The hen also knows that it is dawn, but it allows the cock to announce it. So proverbs such as these, used in daily discourse, endorse masculine inclinations in boys and reinforce gender positions, ensuring that both boys and girls know the appropriate behavior expected of them. Currently, more research is being conducted in masculinity studies across the disciplines in Ghanaian universities. For example, Innings research in 2012 and 2014 examines the representations of masculinity in literary texts, focusing on the dangers of an ideal masculine identity. The research also includes studies that examine men's conception of themselves, such as through the wearing of the beard, to representations of men and hegemony in literary texts and films. Scholars are now engaging vigorously, although tentatively, with the field of masculinities. Studying men is not new. Men have been studying men for a long time and calling it history, sociology, anthropology, to quote her in 2004. These studies may, however, not be explicitly about men, or men may be represented in ways that do not problematize them. So currently, there are studies and literatures that theorize and represent men in other ways, in feminist, gay, queer, etc. studies that are not necessarily mainstream or male-stream, right? As a research interest, scholars ask these questions. How do men behave in the society in which they find themselves? How do they relate with other genders? How do their constructions of themselves as men affect how they think and see the world? Are masculinities evolving? An area of interdependence between men's studies and women's studies is seen in the relationship between femininity and masculinity in African literature. And that is my field, so I would use most of my examples from there. In African literature, the call for the demarginalization of the African woman in literary texts is as a result of the centering of the African male character, a situation which calls for both feminist and masculine reading of the text. What becomes clear is that the seemingly binary opposition between feminine and masculine is rather a part of the gender complex in which the meaning of male power can only be performed or textualized through the interplay of the two poles. So understanding the frailty of masculinity as presented in the characters undergoing a crisis of sexual power, as is seen, for example, in Hala by Semben Osman, makes it pertinent to recognize that masculinity as a conceptual framework of analysis and interrogation will provide a better understanding of gender relations in Africa. In including men in gender studies, a gap is filled in the scholarship on gender, which has for many years become synonymous with women, leaving men as the unmarked and unexamined category. There are some anxieties with the study of men. One main anxiety being that people think that the focus on men will recreate the re-exclusion of women in research, scholarly otherwise. However, one way to avoid this, as Hen 2004 repeats constantly, is that we need to focus on the literature. We need in the research to consistently examine the specific ways in which men can exist as and engendered power relations with men, women, children, young people, and with each other. The focus should be on the power relations and looking at men as gendered beings as well. Currently, because of the focus on men as gendered beings and the power relations, there is this new trend referred to as CSM, Critical Studies on Men, which is a framework for studying men. It focuses on the centrality of power issues in the discussions and studies of men. It refers to that range of studies that critically address men in the context of gender power or gendered power relations. There is also the trend in masculinity studies to interrogate and focus on the fluidity, instability, and contradictory nature of masculinity itself. Thus, a consequence of this is that there's a strong opposition to this hegemonic view of an unchanging or unchangeable and undifferentiated maleness. So now the focus is to move towards what is termed masculinities. And on this note, I'll bring my presentation to an end and give room for my other presenters to build on what I have said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adda-mununkum. We are grateful for your presentation. And definitely will come up with questions to some of the issues that you have talked about, and then you would give us responses to them. But then I'll pick the presentation from Dr. Fu now, Dr. Divine Fu now. And Dr. Fu, he will be speaking on the impact or influence of masculinities, constructions, and performance in popular culture on youth aspirations, agencies, and pathways to becoming. So Dr. Fu, please, it's your turn to present.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and also thank you to colleagues and everyone for being here and giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. And I should really thank Teresa for such a thorough and really profound historicizing of and contextualizing of masculinity studies. I don't think that anyone could have done a better job than you did. So it leaves us with very little to have to talk about or to engage, you know. So I'm going to start from two different points, and I'll try to be very provocative and controversial as a way, you know, to get us to, you know, to think. I came into this conversation because my friend Rachel Spronk insisted that I must have this discussion. I don't know why. I think it's always very difficult to be in a discussion with two very important and established women. You know, I feel like a cockroach in the gathering of fowls. You know, you will be eating up and you have to watch your words really, really well. And I was glad that Akosua Adomofo and also Amina Mama had told me that they were having meetings at this time. They would not attend. So I think I have freedom to try to test a few ideas, knowing that they are not going to crush me now. But I've been fascinated with conceptual work for some time. I am a nerd like many people in academia, and concepts are things we experiment with. And I came across masculinities when I was doing my MA studies. I was a student in Botswana, also seeking to survive. I had come to do development studies, and gender was something that men did not do. And I don't think that has shifted much. I think we are lots of men who are doing gender studies, but gender is really something that, you know, to be a man, you should stay away from topics that are considered like either weak or, you know, either soft, you know. So some of us who pretend to venture into this space, you know, also tend to be associated with a very kind, a particular kind of weak masculinities, you know. And because you're not really engaging subjects that are considered really theoretical or considered powerfully conceptual, contributing to theories of knowledge. And I think what Teresa has demonstrated is that this is actually a body of literature which really contributes to a big a theory of knowledge. And I came across Masculinities from my professor, Hudisang Mukodi, who was teaching a course in gender studies in Botswana. And then I began to read about Kopano Ratele's work, which is really key to grounding masculinities, especially from a different ontological position, because we must not forget that in this context of debates and discussions about decolonizing work, decolonizing epistemic work, that one's ontological experience also plays a very key role. And I think feminists understand this more than anyone else, that to be able to articulate that particular subject position and experience, one sometimes need to fall in this confusion with biology, you know. Kopano Ratele's work was really important in grounding that these studies. Then I read work from Robert Morel and Stefan Meische, which Teresa has mentioned. And if you see, a lot of this work is coming from historians, you know. Kopano Ratele is not a historian, but psychology. Then you have also historians. So it's a lot of this literature on masculinities on the continent comes out of the work of people in health, people in history, and also people in psychology. That also means that it is framed, you know, in a particular way. You know, over the past years, we've had, you know, anthropologists, sociologists, and others begin to engage this work, but the foundational work has remained really key. And I think that's something that we need to think about, people who are studying masculinity, who are researching masculinities, need to think about. But when I was studying gender studies with Hudisang Mukodi and reading all of this work from Rolling Cornell and Meische and Rob Morel, I was also reading work from people like Ife Amadiome, from Oyeronko Oyewomi and Amina Mama, and really important work which was interrogating the notions of gender and what it meant, you know, to be doing gender, you know, within an African context, or what it means for African voices to be part of this conversation on gender. And I was fascinated at that time with the argument made by Oyewomi and also Amadiome about woman as an invention, you know, the category during those years, you know, as an invention. And I want to enter this conversation today with that, by provoking that, and also just stating that masculinities is an invention, and that as a concept, we actually need to really think critically and consider actually throwing it away. And it also means asking ourselves, what would it mean to throw away masculinity as an analytical concept, you know? And if we were to throw it away, what would we be focusing on? And I'm saying this for several reasons. I think that masculinity, as we have seen, and as I think Teresa has presented, and as we would read from a lot of the literature, emerges, is a product of contact with empire. It's a product of the contact with modernization. And I would say that it's also a product of the violence that has emerged after the post-colony, and also especially within the context of HIV. So masculinity is a notion mainly often associated with violence, or often associated also with health, you know, issues. So we tend to treat it as a pathology, and that is something that I have tended to argue and continue to push, and maybe I try to investigate, just to try to demonstrate that because we have taken this notion from this place, already it is tainted. And that is what I think when we talk about toxic masculinity, I think it's a contradiction itself, because masculinity is already supposed to be toxic, because it is something that is associated with a particular kind of male behavior, a particular kind of man. And I would argue that it is something that the empire left with us to replace a particular image and version masculinity at that time, which was supposed to be feared, which was kind of a hyper male, you know, a hyper African male, a hyper black male, you know, a man that needed to be feared in the imagination of the European psyche. And that is why I think this is something that one needs to throw away, one needs to abandon, or one needs to acknowledge that it is a term that is associated, you know, with a contemporary, with empire. And I think in their last works, I think Robert Morel and Roland Connell, and I have also seen Fekane has been writing about that, and increasingly I think Ratele and others asking that we need to find ways to rethink and to decolonize masculinities, you know, as a concept, which is part of this work, which also Roland is doing, Roland Connell is doing around Southern theory. What does it mean to think theory from the South, or what is Southern theory? And therefore, I think that when one talks about youth, to go to youth and masculinities now, that youth, to talk about youth and young and associated that with masculinities is again a contradiction, because I think masculinities is something that is particularly associated with a kind of young man, a kind of acting in a way that really represents you as a young man, risky behavior, violence, you know, and all sorts of I think bad, you know, behavior, or immature, you know, in certain contexts, and therefore toxicity or toxic masculinity, I think, is a tautology. So what I'm proposing, perhaps, is that we need to ask questions about particular notions and what we gain or lose from trying to look for alternatives. If we were to look for alternatives, what would these alternatives be? And perhaps what we need to do is to interrogate and historicize, just as we've done with masculinities, other concepts and terminologies such as manhood, for example, you know, manhood, which is also part of becoming. I think some of what we have described about what it means to become in a Kant society relates more to manhood than to masculinities. And we have to look at the differences between what it means, you know, to define somebody as masculine and, you know, because there what we are doing is trying to navigate and the boundaries between biology, sociology, history, but also ontological experiences. What does it mean? I think there's a difference, for example, between the toxicity of a guy called Trump and the toxicity of another guy called Biden, you know, and that there's a difference, the toxicity of another guy called Divine. So what one needs to do is to find a framework that allows us to understand it, but not to lump them all into the same group. And I think why we think that by calling it masculinities and pluralities is a way to go. But I think in the specific context of Africa, masculinities is something that is associated with already toxicity. So it does not allow us the freedom to be able to actually interrogate and understand this notion further. And perhaps, you know, if one were to locate that within a feminist work, and to be even more controversial, is that if we can make a difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity, perhaps we also have to go back to patriarchy and make a difference between patriarchy and toxic patriarchy. And that might actually allow us to even deepen some of the understandings of what we think is masculinities. And then to move to popular aspects of popular culture, you know. So what has happened is that popular culture on the continent and over the past years, that we are finding ways to associate it necessarily with masculinity. So when people travel now to across the Sahara to go to Europe, we are finding ways to try to relate that, you know, with masculinities, whether it's in fashion, you know, we are trying to relate that with masculinities. We are seeing in the work, like the work that Didier Gondola is doing on sapeurs. We are seeing that in the work that we are doing on Scotanes, for example, in South Africa. We're also trying to find relationships with terminology such as metro male, you know, to relate. But sometimes I argue that I'm not part of the metropolis, and therefore I need a particular a kind of construct, you know, to define me. So I'm just going to end there by pushing us, you know, further, asking perhaps Lindsay as she enters into her own conversation to push that concept. What would it mean to abandon this concept? What would it mean to throw it? What would we do, or can we do it? And I think we need to decolonize and to think about it differently. It's an invention. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Fu. We're grateful for your presentation. Those, I'm interested with the fact that you say that masculinity, it's toxic in itself. So there's no point saying we have toxic masculinity and then whatever. So I'll be coming back to you with that. But now Professor Close would have her turn to present on masculinity in African scholarship. And she'll be throwing light on the absence and presence of students in masculinity and gender studies broadly. Prof, you have the floor now.
Well, after two presentations like that, that's a hard set of acts to follow, but I will do my best. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It would have been much easier, I think, to have gone first, but here we are. Here I am doing my coming up last. I'm very much honored to be here, and I hope I can take some of the ideas that have been raised and take something forward with them. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the South African context, but I do think it has a relevance for other parts of the world. And certainly from some of the things that Teresa and Divine have said, they resonate with me. So I think there are certainly useful overlaps. I'm sure that most of you know something about the South African context, the post-apartheid. The fact is that very little has changed. I still live in, I mean, some things have changed, but on the other hand, very little has changed. I still live in a society in which race inequalities privilege white people. I live in a society in which gender inequalities continue to privilege men. I live in a society in which class inequalities continue to privilege the rich, in a heterosexist society in which privilege accrues to being heterosexual. And a lot of writers have shown how those kinds of features are typical of post-colonial societies. And in terms of higher education in South Africa, the student protests over the last few years have underlined how those inequalities have been and continue to be reproduced in South Africa through higher education, even while higher education is supposedly meant to be dismantling those inequalities. There's a lot of research by people, and Divine, in fact, has done some of this research, which confirms ways in which South Africa higher education is implicated in both challenging and reproducing those legacies, those historical legacies, imperial colonial legacies of inequality. So from the perspective of gender studies, it's precisely those inequalities, the daily injustices that they give rise to, and the intersections between them, that are the focus of the curriculum and the focus of postgraduate research. And while gender is obviously central to other social locations, ethnicity and religion, sexuality, nationality, class, race, and so on, they all matter because they continue to shape everybody's lives in South Africa and I think elsewhere, lives and opportunities in all sorts of complex ways. And one of the ways they do this, and this is where I'm connecting now with what Divine was talking about and Teresa was talking about, is by making it extremely difficult for young men to engage with feminist theory at university, to take courses in which gender is taken seriously. So on the one hand, being a young man at university is completely normative. It is not exceptional or remarkable in any kind of way. That's exemplified at UWC by a statue celebrating the graduate. It's a young man stepping forward with a certificate in his hand, and behind him is a woman stepping backwards with a broom. So she's his mother and he is the graduate. She's the stereotypical domestic worker, single-handedly supporting the male graduate rather than getting an education herself. So being a man at university, in South Africa anyway, is completely unproblematic. It's normative. But if it's normative, it's only okay as long as men stay within the boundaries of normative masculinity. Break the rules around that, what it means to be a man at university, and trouble swiftly emerges. So I've got two stories to tell about that. And the first is about 15 years ago, I suppose, when a young man arrived from Kenya, and he was doing research, postgraduate research for a master's degree on women's vulnerability to HIV/AIDS. And he registered in the anthropology department, where his professors advised him to do a postgrad elective in my department with Professor Desiree Lewis on feminist theory. It's a kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? If you're going to do work on gendered vulnerabilities, then you familiarize yourself with gender theory, but coming out of feminist theory. He came to one class where he realized he was going to end up with a module called Trends in Contemporary Feminist Theory on his academic transcript. And he was horrified at the idea. So he dropped the module and we never saw him again. So getting familiar with feminist theory that could allow him to ask those questions that Divine was saying we need to ask was unthinkable for him. It wasn't possible for him to do that. The second story I want to share is about undergrads. I teach an intro to intro to sex, gender and sexuality, the gender studies module every year. There's about 200 students doing it this year. And it's mainly female students. This year, 2020, was about 170 women students and about 30 male or people who identified as men. And I used to get those students to do an assignment in which I asked them to break a gender norm. We'd brainstorm ideas in class. Girls had lots of ideas, challenging their parents about the allocation of household chores, drinking alcohol, drinking beer out of a can, asking men out, a whole range of things. And we talked about the embodied experiences of just thinking about breaking a gender norm. Your raised heart rate, sweaty hands, butterflies in your tummy, and so on. So the aim of the exercise was for students to think about ways in which they had internalized gendered expectations, how powerful these norms were, how nervous they were about challenging them, how they'd internalized them. And some never did break the norm but that was fine. They still had lots to write about. They had to write about why they couldn't break it. When we came to brainstorming what male students could do, what emerges every year is that they've already broken a gender norm by signing up for that course. Studying gender was transgressive in itself for men. It represents a challenge to dominant understandings of appropriate masculinity. They'd all had to already explain themselves to their families, to their friends, to their co-students. They'd had to account, why are you doing a course in feminism? They've seen their sexuality questioned, they've been labeled as gay, they've been labeled as queer, as girly. In the South African lexicon, it would be they've been labeled as morphes. They've been laughed at, their studies trivialized, dismissed, challenged by parents, family, neighbors, as well as friends and other students. They all had to find a reason to do my course. It's Introduction to Gender Studies. That, they just needed one credit, and this was going to be an easy course. They had to find a reason to do it, but didn't articulate an interest in gender studies. So what I learned from this is that most of the young men at my university understand that being a man at universities is fine as long as you stay in your lane, that you mustn't engage with feminist theory that underpins gender studies. It's a challenge to gender normativity. It's perceived as a betrayal of your gender, a challenge to the patriarchy. So that's the first idea emerging out of the idea of men at university, that while the default students imagined as man, and a man with no domestic obligations, they're actually quite stringent and unwritten, unspoken rules about the kind of intellectual growth that's permitted or facilitated. And I know I'm generalizing here, but I think that this applies to other institutions around the world. The absence of men from feminist classrooms is not special to South Africa. And of course, underpinning this belief, and Teresa's alluded to it, and I think also Divine, but is the belief, mistaken belief, that gender, it refers to women, that only women have a gender. And the nonsense, of course, is that gender is nothing if not relational. What it means to be feminine is defined by what it means to be masculine. So what I want to talk about next, I want to draw on the work of Kopano Ratele, because I agree with Divine that his work is absolutely foundational. And this is something that he did in 2008, but I don't think it's publicized enough. I don't think people know about it enough. So first of all, South Africa is globally known for having extremely high rates of gender-based violence. Kopano Ratele, with women being killed, I think it's 8 every, I can't remember how many it is now. A woman killed every 8 hours. I think it's the, the stereotypical figure that is produced when they talk about gender-based violence in South Africa. Kopano showed that for every woman who's killed by a man in South Africa, men are killed by men in South Africa. Men kill each other in South Africa at a phenomenal rate. Ratele also drew on census figures to show how gender intersects with race, sexuality, and class to shorten South African men's lives, to take decades off their lives. His work shows that white South African men's lives are cut short by 20 or 30 years. They're buried in their late 40s and 50s. Their racial, sexual, class privileges exposing them to stress-related diseases such as heart attacks and strokes. Black men's lives are cut short by 30 or 40 years. They're buried in their early 40s with race, class, gender, and sexuality, working together to expose them to sexually transmitted diseases such as HIV, understandings that early and multiple sexual encounters are what makes you more of a man. So there's a spike in the death rate for Black men in their 40s. Colored men, this the racial nomenclature that's still used in South Africa, their lives are cut short by as much as 50 years. They're buried in their teens or early 20s as race, class, gender, sexual privileges expose them to gangsterism. Elaine Saylor has written a lot about this. And that's, of course, before we start to talk about risky behaviors around alcohol and drugs and how that increases men's chances of getting involved in accidents, violence with other men, with their families, and so on. So the thing is, for men, gender really matters. Their gender puts their lives at risk, and where it doesn't kill them, it can leave them physically or mentally harmed in positions where many have destroyed their own support networks, children who don't know who their fathers are or who're scared of their fathers. And as Bell Hooks notes, patriarchy harms boys, and this is going a long time back, patriarchy harms boys first, and through that harming, encourages boys and men to harm themselves as well as others. To challenge those gendered norms, and this is what I think both Teresa and Divine are both arguing, we need to understand them, we need to theorize them, we need to question them. And women have a lot of insight into all of this, precisely because women do gender studies. We do take courses in feminist theory. And there are exceptions, of course. There are men who are involved in gender studies, and Divine is one of those, and others. There's a number emerging in South Africa who have emerged, taking some significant leadership positions. Malosi Langa, Bukumzi Mfafani, and there's other men emerging in gender studies over the continent. But overall, young men globally occupy a social location where they're denied the opportunity as individuals and as a social group to access the theoretical tools that would enable them to challenge the gender norms within which they are embedded, the gendered, racialized, sexualized, and class legacies of colonialism, imperialism, industrialization, and in South Africa, apartheid, and so on, that all work together to see them die young or end up in prison or alone or harmed in other ways. So in my teaching, I've tried to challenge that, but with very limited success. Since about 2010, the course that introduction course focuses on masculinities. It surprises everybody because the focus is masculinities rather than femininities. They're all expecting femininities. And we draw on work of international scholars, but also a lot of South African scholars. We have guest lecturers. So Teresa, in fact, guest lectured on that course a few years ago when she was based at UWC. But despite all that, and I've been doing that since 2010, there's still very few men in that class. Of that almost 200 students, there's maybe 20 or 30 young men. Most of those are there because they'd run out of other options. They didn't really want to be there. I think I probably run out of time, so maybe I should stop there. And yeah, I think that what I'm seeing there is the absence of young men from the theoretical tools that will allow them or facilitate the questioning of those imperial legacies of inequality that we all continue to live with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Close. And one of our participants shares a story similar to what you shared whilst you were presenting. And he mentions the fact that a gentleman came to him for advice on a course to read, and he actually recommended that the person takes a program, a study in gender. And this gentleman goes to the class for just one time, comes back and tells him that there seems to be too few men in the class. So it's unfortunate he cannot be part of such, a class. And he said he felt it was worthy to share and then indicate that it indeed, just as Dr. Fu said, masculinity is really toxic. So that will make me dive directly to Dr. Fu and ask, are you sure all masculinity is toxic? Dr. Adda-mununkum is asking you this question.
Thank you. I think I should restate my argument in order to not be beaten after this. I'm arguing that masculinity as an analytical concept, as deployed to analyze the African context, is essentially toxic, right? Because masculinity as a tool for understanding relationships in African phenomena grows already out of a toxic context. So it is used to try to understand a crisis, for example. So when you see this about crisis, it emerges especially out of HIV. And in that context of trying to understand HIV, it emerges as really pathological, because it is responsible for a lot of risky behaviors. And then it is used also to understand and explain the violence on the continent. I mean, South Africa is a case, but out of South Africa, we have all of the conflicts. When you read work about the conflicts in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Niger, in many of these other places, you find that masculinities as a concept is at the center of explaining this context. But whether all male actions and relationships are toxic is something else. I wouldn't say all of it is toxic, but I would say that once one deploys masculinity as a tool to analyze, it comes with an entire history, which Teresa started off by recounting. And I think that history itself is essentially toxic. That's the argument.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Fu. To our participants, you're welcome to send your messages, contribution. It could be a question. You're welcome to send it to us. You go to the chat section and then you type it in there, and I can pose your question for you. Read whatever comment you want to put across. Let me come back to Dr. Adda-mununkum. You gave us a splendid presentation on the origins and trends of masculinity, and you did give us a lot of examples from the Ghanaian context. Let's find out, what is the trend of masculinity discourses within Ghana, within the Ghanaian context?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that mostly when you look at the research coming, as I said, you see a lot of it from the social sciences, looking at predominantly masculine behavior. I remember one research that Dr. Dojin Odro is working on is about beard wearing, the configuration of identity through the wearing of the beard. She examined young men who wear the beard and trying to find out why they do that and to what end. And from the research, you notice that it is not just, for some of them it's a fashion trend, but for others, it is a conceptualization of themselves, an identity for themselves, trying to create a certain form of identity to stand out from the norm. So there is that. And it cuts across the research. You see people trying to make sense out of men's behavior in social context. And we also find some in health, where men's attitude towards health-seeking activities is also researched into, why men are prone to certain diseases than women, etc. And In literary circles, especially in my field of study, what we tend to do is to look at the texts that we have, the books we read, and we want to look at, we try to look at the representations of manhood and maleness in there, and looking at how things are changing. So in my own research, I noticed that with the new texts that are being written, tests set in cosmopolitan communities, tests set in the 2000s, I mean, in recent years, you'd notice that these configurations of maleness are reflecting the changing trends in the communities, in the societies. I mean, you can go as far back as Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart, and you see Okonkwo's conceptualization of himself as a man, and you read a book like Hamatan Rain, and you look at this male character conception of himself, and he breaks all the gender norms reserved for men. You know, he doesn't set out to be the alpha male. He is happy to be seen as, some people even refer to him as a feminized version of a man, and he's okay with that. So, and you see this in contemporary society. So this is how I see the trend. And as I said, it's quite encouraging that more and more research is being done in men's studies or masculinity studies across the various disciplines. We just need more. We need people to engage with it more. And it will be more helpful if we get men to engage with the research more. Right. I think somebody was wondering why we have we have two women talking about masculinity studies,
exactly.
right? And not men. I think, as we've already talked about, men are a bit hesitant delving into gender, as if gender is equated to femininity or woman. But that is not the case, as has been the intention of these webinars all along, to show people that gender refers to both genders, not just the woman or the female, right? So we need more men to get involved, get on board, and be doing more research. Because as we say, it's only you who can tell your story, right? And we have some men in other parts of the world engaging in this research. So we need more Ghanaian men to be involved, and they can begin from when they take these gender classes.
Right. So, Dr. Fu, let me come to you. Briefly, can you tell us, how do you think we can whip the interest of male students in taking courses or studies when it comes to gender, so that we would be able to get them to understand some of these basic things we are talking about? How do we whip the interest of students?
Is that to me or to Lindsay?
No, to you, Doc. Fu.
You mean business and me today?
Yes, very much.
Yeah, I think I would pose the question, start by asking, how can we get not just students, how can you get professors to teach gender? How can you get professors to teach feminist theory? Feminism is a theory about life. Apart from just being, actually, it's also a theory about, interdependent life, living a more ethical space. So I think we've tended to reduce it as something that just relates to a particular condition, but it's a theory about life. It's a theory about understanding society, building a more ethical world. And the point at which we are able to grow out of that, then we can respond to that question. As long as we think that it is something that is narrow, that should be taught in a gender department, should be taught in a feminist department, in a feminist group, in a feminist research space, I'm sorry, that question will not be, that we are all to blame. Those of us who teach gender, those of us who teach feminism, those of us who teach history, geography, we are all to blame for it. Because we've taken it and narrowed it, we've provincialized it as something that only relates to that space, And just to say, the literature on research on men on the continent is also really, to some extent, dominated by a lot of men also. So I think gender generally, as a field, really women, feminist work, there are more women. We need more men to do feminist research. But when it comes to masculinity studies, when you look at a lot of the people that you listed in the historiography that Teresa did, it was Ratela, it was Misha, it was, you know, I mean, it was used to be Connell before there was change, and then Rowling, you know, so that field is really dominated by men. So because it's an ontological experience, it's the same like feminism. But when we change that, once we transform feminism and really frame it as a theory about life, I think we'll respond to that question.
Right. Sure. Thank you very much. I have this comment from Forgive Awo Novivi, and it says, fortunately in my university, I teach on an introductory gender course which has been made compulsory. This is so that all students would be enlightened on the gender issues. But again, it is mostly up to me as an instructor to help them to understand the issues properly and even to an extent sustain their interest in the course. Now, to Professor Close, I have one that is coming from John Oti Amwa. And he says he thinks employing intersectionality as an analytical tool will be useful in an attempt to unpack the complex intersecting identities, gender, age, ethnicity, race, etc. of men. Do you agree with him, Prof?
Yes, no, I do. He's absolutely right. And I think the strength of taking an intersectional approach means that you can actually look at particular contexts, because the identities that emerge that matter in that particular context can be lifted out, teased out and considered. So it's taking an intersectional approach means that you can look at regional differences across time and space. It's not something it's an approach to data rather than a theory. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I also think that it helps to unpack the idea of a toxic masculinity. Papano Ratele has written about this. He's critiqued the idea of hegemonic masculinity, which I think is really in post-colonial contexts. And I think it's really important to think about that, or to think critically about that. So I suppose my call for, and I think Divine and Teresa's call as well, is that we need to develop theory from Africa, from Ghana or South Africa or wherever, to critique those theories that have emerged out of different contexts. That we have to own that theory. It has to emerge out of our own context. The theory develops through critique. And so I would agree that I find it difficult to actually say, well, we should all masculinity is toxic. I'm not down that road yet, Divine, but I do think you have a point. I think you have an important point. So an intersectionality is key to all of that.
Right, thank you very much. Dr. Adda-mununkum, let me come to you again. Hegemonic masculinities seem to accrue positively to those who achieve them. What accounts for the so-called anxieties?
Let me begin from the anxieties. The anxieties of masculinity. I begin from this idea that other gender students or scholars have when we talk about masculinity or masculinities, that if we want to focus on men now, won't we be neglecting women? And hey, haven't we been talking about men all these years, you know, since the beginning of time? And was it not that which led us to decide to focus on women as well? Especially when I look at literature, for example, right? Women were left out of the focal discourse, and the focus was on men and their achievements and women as auxiliaries or appendages. So that is one anxiety in there. But then the answer to that question is we've decided or we've agreed that when we talk about gender, we are looking at the feminine and the masculine poles working together. And so you cannot divorce one from the other. Without femininity, there's no masculinity. So they go together. So there's no need to fear that in talking about masculinity, we are going to neglect women. It depends on how you look at it. And as I said, Hen said, we need to be looking at men as gendered beings. And once you look at them as gendered beings whose constructions are also socially constructed or socially created, then the discussion becomes clearer. Now, what are some of the other anxieties of men? This takes me a little bit into psychology. You know, this idea that when men are discussed or opened up, they lose that mystique with which we associate them with. Men's power will be taken away. You know, so we hide all men behind this idea that all men have power, all men are hegemonic. But that is not true. Not all men have power, not all men are hegemonic. Actually, there's a small percentage of men who are truly hegemonic, right? And so when we even look at this category of that we refer to as men, and we unpack them, you'd notice that within that same category, there are men who are subordinated. If I should have an example, I mean, if you have the president, right? The president of a country, can say is the ultimate alpha man, and then you'd have a man who is a cleaner at the university. The power differentials between them is quite clear, right? And so not all men have power. Even though all men have some level of power, they are not the same, right? Now, when we talk about, most people talk about toxic masculinities, we are interested in how men use their power to oppress other men and women. And that is where hegemonic masculinity has come under a lot of attack, because people associate hegemonic masculinity with toxicity. Okay, so when you have power and you abuse this power in your relationship with other men and women, and then it becomes toxic. I think I'll leave it there.
Right, thank you. Doc, this one is coming from Bless, and it says, I do agree with Doc Theresa that post-2000 literary texts reflect that masculinities congruently change with space and time. However, I have noticed from my research on representations of masculinities in South African literature, at least, not all representations of masculinities show that some men are comfortable with the new man label. Also, women often are perpetrators and gatekeepers of toxic traits in men, whether deliberate or not. I think I am inclined to think that this is due to an inherent socialization of both men and women over and above impacts like migration, globalization, among others. And this contribution came from...
Very right.
Yes, it came from Divine. This is also another one to Dr. adda-mununkum. I like it when you said men should get into research into gender, since it is only men who can tell their stories. Don't you think that that is further accentuating the problem of gender stratification and making it more difficult, especially when there are social and cultural constructs that require them to demonstrate specific characteristics? I suggest women include the study of men more so as to break the barrier, as Professor Lindsay Close has been doing in her introductory class. Dr. adda-mununkum.
This is interesting, and it's open for debate. I remember when this issue of, in the late 70s, this issue of women writing their own stories, telling their own stories, talking about the demarginalization of women in African literature, if I should use that, even setting as an example. And one scholar, Ogundipe Leslie, said that African women should tell their own stories because they know exactly what it is like to be a woman. That doesn't mean that men can tell the stories of women. Men can tell women's stories. But then we want more women to engage with the telling and articulation of their own stories. We want to hear their own voices. Now, getting women involved in masculinity studies is very good. We all look at the study from different perspectives with different lenses, you understand? But then we also believe that it's also more important when men come to tell us exactly what it is like to be a man. more often than not, in my gender class, for example, you would have to tease out this from the male students. And then they would agree with you, and then they'll come out and say, yes, it's true. This is how we feel. This is how we are socialized to behave, right? But they are reluctant to tell their own stories. So I'm not advocating for a construct where only men will talk about masculinity or only women will talk about it. Both of them should be engaged in this discourse. But then I believe that we need more men, as Fo said, in the international scene, you have a lot of men engaged in this discourse, and that is fine. So on the Ghanaian scene, we also need more men to engage in that discourse as well. And with regard to this idea about women being the gatekeepers of toxic masculinity and toxic behaviors, yes, it is true. We see that in the literature a lot, and we all understand what is happening because of the socialization as well. But then also, we must not lose sight of the fact that some people are not aware that they are being gatekeepers. They actually believe that they are upholding traditions that are for the benefit of the communities. So I just leave that one out there.
Right. Dr. Fu, this is to you. Akwele Otu, and he's smiling. Dr. Fu, you seem to be taking us on a tour. You just changed where you were. This is coming from Akwele Otu. And the question says, could it be said that toxic masculinity creates anxieties for men?
Yeah, sorry for taking you to a tour. I have to multitask. So one of the things
I understand that
is childcare. So while I am sitting talking, it means that I have to increase the social reproductive burden of my wife as I am doing this great talk. So I've had to share the social reproductive labor by coming to take care of the kids. So that's why I'm moving. But could it be said that toxic masculinity creates anxieties for men? I'll still go back to what I posed. So if masculinity is not toxic, what is it? If it's not toxic, what else is? Do you want to give me examples of what you consider soft masculinities, great masculinities? Essentially on this continent, and I will continue to buttress this argument that the interest in masculinities emerges out of a time where it is important to frame, to look for answers. Why is there so much HIV? Why is AIDS spreading? Why is there so much conflict? And the response to that was masculinity that time. So when you look at Teresa's historicizing, it emerges out of that time. And then a lot of work from there has been connecting to that literature, just trying to understand, so these are the expectations, these are the ideals, and since then, I think that has polluted. It's not that they're not toxic masculinities. That's my daughter's feet, on my face. It's not that they're not toxic or soft masculinities. It's that as an analytical concept to understand the African condition, as I think it's Puleng who has written in the chat that especially in the South African context, masculinity seems to be a notion that you use to analyze Black men, not that there are no studies of whiteness, but quite often the analysis is about Black men, the analysis is about African men. So we need to be able to decenter that, to decolonize that. And that's what I'm pushing for. And that's what I think we need to abandon it or re-theorize or rehistoricize it because it emerges out of a particular moment. But of course, the anxieties, of course. Men have all sorts of anxieties about their own expectations on a daily basis, learning to become, I have people writing, friends writing, like colleagues used to talk during the HIV/AIDS. You read a lot of literature during the heyday of HIVs in the 90s and 80s that, you know, people don't talk about sexuality or sex on the continent. But what do men talk about? Is talk about sex and all of the insecurities, you know, and all of the anxieties about so much talk about it that it provokes anxieties because of the expectations of what it means to perform, you know, and then all the ideas about becoming man, becoming a good man, becoming a special man, whether it's in class trying to pass, whether it is having to, you know, build a house, buy a house, and, you know, and become. So there's so many, but there are other things that provoke anxiety. So I think the fact that somebody does not like to take a gender course, which is really a misogynist, is also because of many other reasons. Like I didn't study drama and theater arts, for example. I started with drama and theater arts, and my mom asked me, you know, well, what is that going to give you? She needed me to be able to do a profession that would allow us to pay for our debts, you know, because like some have argued, some of us inherit just debts and diseases. So you have to make sure that you push for to be in spaces that would increase your chances. So what we need to do is to see how, and that's I think where intersectionality and all of these other tools come into play, to try to understand how is it that all these different things, you know, intersect. But it's not essentially toxic, and also it does not essentially cause anxieties.
All right, thank you very much. Sadly, this might be the very last question I'm going to pose to Professor Close. And Georgia Pia says, I suspect some men are not interested in gender studies because they feel ignored in respect of issues that affect them. Professor Close, do you agree with him on this one?
I'm not sure about that. I think that gender studies has a bad rep. Or feminist theory has a bad rep. It's seen as a Western import that's hostile to Black men, and I think that's a big problem, because in many ways perhaps it is or has been. So the historical legacies have generated, and this again, it's Divine's point, the historical legacies of theory are Western centric, and it's really important to develop local theorizing, to critique. It's no good saying that theory is no good, we're not using it. We have to develop our own critiques, that the local indigenous critiques of theory from other parts of the world is what matters. So that's my anxiety, is that we need to generate our own theory. We need to critique those theories. So
right,
I think men feel ignored. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I had earlier said that would have been my last one, but Dr. Fu, I'm not going to let you go without this last one. Dr. Janet wants to know, does the concept genuine masculinity exist at all?
No, it's an abstraction, because what is genuine masculinity? It's like the concept tradition, you know? We throw it like as if there is, because what the assumption in this concept is that there is something that is fixed, that is never changing, and that is natural, and that is timeless, you know? And we know very well that even tradition itself borrows from one thing to the other. It changes and changes and changes. There was a time when, you know, becoming man meant that you need to go to a particular initiation school, you know. Then that even the practices within that initiation school also changes, you know. There was a time when people were naked. There was a time when they were clothed. There was a time when you performed. So it changes and it shifts. And it's the same thing with masculinity or masculine. I think biology would tell us that there are particular either chromosomes, you know, that belongs to men and, you know, and to women, and that there is something called testosterone that, you know, is something that is dominant in men, and something called estrogen that is dominant, in women. And I think there are things that we need to acknowledge, because I will never really understand what it is to have estrogen, that's secreted. I will never understand. And I think many people will never understand what it is to have testosterone and what it is to be managing testosterone. Those are things that are really central. But in testosterone and in estrogen, it's a social being. It's a person. And every society and every context has it different. And even in a society, it is different in families, it is different in relationship. So there are certain ideals, but that there is something called really genuine, no, doesn't exist. That's an abstraction.
Right. On that note, I would say thank you to all of you. And this is where time would allow us to end our discussion on masculinities, anxieties, and acceptances. At this point, I'll go back to my director for the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy, and Documentation, UCC, Dr. Georgina Odro, for her closing remarks.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our speakers and our participants. It's been a very engaging afternoon. And we started with Dr. Teresa Adda-mununkum setting the pace. And she really set the pace with the historicity and the contextual constructions of masculinity, getting examples from Ghana, but also from other literary works. We really appreciate that. And then we got Divine, bringing in his humor and trying to provoke us by thinking through other concepts and then other types of masculinity. He made reference to works by Cornell, by Capolo, and other theorists. But he also did emphasize the need for us as Africans to try and then construct our own theories if we really want to decolonize and then move forward with it. He did mention how different studies on masculinity in the area of health, in the area of HIV/AIDS, in the area of violence and others have really pushed us to the concept of toxic masculinity, which is not too positive. So that set us thinking, is there anything like positive masculinities? How can we achieve that, if any? And then it was continued by Professor Close in the area of scholarship or gender studies with reference to masculinity studies. So as I sat listening, what I asked myself is, do we as higher educational institutions need to introduce masculinity studies separately instead of maybe gender studies, where we sometimes just give masculinity studies a topic and for that matter sort of subdue it? Maybe it is time for us to consider masculinity studies as a standalone subject on its own so that we give it more attention. Also, the concept of, or the idea of how to get more men interested in gender studies also came up strongly. And to me, it's food for thought for all of us to think through in our various institutions, in our various capacities, how we can get more interested in the studies of gender studies, but also masculinity studies. This brings to something that was being done in our university, the University of Cape Coast. We used to have an introductory study in gender studies for all students. Unfortunately, it was scrapped off, but discussing this topic this afternoon and then engaging and listening shows that there is the need for us to revisit that and then engender the curriculum if you really want to push forward the discourse of masculinity studies. Thank you so much. I can't thank you all, our participants, the very engaging persons which got us thinking, our moderator, our provost, and all others. Next month, we'll be looking at gender mainstreaming in the academy. And we encourage all of you to once again join us as we deliberate on the subject matter of gender studies. Thank you all. We really appreciate your time and your input.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Odro. We are grateful. Prof, I don't know if you have anything to say. Are you good? Can we sign off now? That's the Provost for the College of Humanities and Legal Studies, Professor Mukwando.
I've really enjoyed the discussions, and what I will leave is we have to keep the gender studies. To me, gender studies is a mixed bag. And so whether feminism, masculinity, and they are in the same basket. And we have to focus on the learning and research on the two. And I'm happy the genesis that Teresa gave us, that even there are proverbs on masculinity in the Ghanaian, whether Akan or all the ethnic groups, there are proverbs. So it's something inherent, and we need to really understand both men and women so that we can meaningfully address challenges, phenomena that's facing the entire world. And so a deeper understanding of the two sides of the coin.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much. Professor Mukwando is a provost for the College of Humanities and Legal Studies here at the University of Cape Coast. It's been a pleasure having all of you here. Dr. Theresa adda-mununkum, Dr. Divine, who felt at a point I was just being on his tail the whole time through. And then Professor Lindsay Close, it's been a pleasure meeting all of you and having this interesting interaction with you. Thank you so much to our participants. You've been wonderful. We look forward to our next engagement next month. Until then, enjoy the rest of this month and the next month as well. All the best, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. 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 Thanks.
Bye all.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Lizzie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.